Thanks everyone for being here, for joining us for this panel that's about arts and creative media and what those things can offer to the questions of combating ageism and the future of intergenerational communities. As Martha said, my name is Mike Kinney. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Stanford Center on Longevity in the Department of Music here at Stanford. And I'm very pleased to be joined by two brilliant scholars and friends who are at the forefront of humanistic research on issues of aging and artistic media, working at the intersections of literature, music, film, and digital storytelling. So right here to my left is Andrea Charise, who is acting associate vice principal of research and innovation and associate professor in the Department of Health and Society at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Woo! Canadians in the house. And at the far end, Tiffany Naiman, who is director of the music industry program at UCLA and also was at Stanford for a bit. So welcome back, Tiffany, to Stanford. Today, we want to discuss how creative practices and humanistic research address the themes of this summit. And I know that we've all had this experience here that when you tell someone that you work on music and aging or aging in the arts, the first response often is, oh, so like music therapy or arts therapy. And we say, no, that's not what we do. So I thought it would be a good idea to just start by going down the line and kind of just explaining what we do as humanities scholars, and especially in this space of aging research, and the types of questions that we spend our time with, but maybe more importantly, how we answer those questions that we spend our time with. So maybe, Andrea, would you like us to begin?
Nice. Thank you so much for that introduction, Michael, and to Martha and all for the invitation to come here. It's nice to be a bit of well, I'll talk a little bit about anomalies. It's nice to be a little unusual in the panel, so I appreciate the time and space for this work. So my name's Andrea Charise. I am indeed from the University of Toronto. No, you can't come back with me. And sorry, too soon. May also be too late. I am an arts-based health researcher. I will say that again. I am an arts-based health researcher. And to some, that might sound like a contradiction. How arts and health, how can they live together? I certainly grew up in an undergraduate / post-secondary setting where arts and health were from different planets. And so what I do in my research and my teaching is I look at how arts, and more specifically how arts engagement, can be understood as supportive in some ways to outcomes we would call health or well-being. And more specifically, I do that kind of work with and for older people, and increasingly in the context of intergenerational research and relationship development. So arts and health, I am attracted to contradictions. I think I can put that at this point in my life. I completed a PhD in English literature as I was very much doing what would probably be classically or maybe uncontroversially understood as like super clinical health research in geriatrics. So my life has very much been a kind of a both and model. And as I've had a chance to kind of look back and say, okay, PhD in English, 20 years of research experience as a clinical researcher in geriatrics, what do these things have in common? Nothing, no. What they have in common is an appreciation and an understanding of complexity. And that complexity is not an anomaly. Complexity is not an exception or an error. That complexity is, in fact, what makes the human element of an 800-page novel, or the perioperative factors that affect delirium in older patients prior to surgery and so on. Complexity is the point, and we need to appreciate, respect, and find ways to live amidst complexity. And that's for me where the arts, in my case, literature, but also the health research in geriatrics, that's where these things begin to look at each other and say, I know you. We do things similarly in some respects, they're very differently in others. So the kinds of questions that motivate my work in this space, my students say these are deep questions. They're deep questions. So just as a warning, the questions that matter to me, and again, they're deep, they're theoretical, but I also, I hope I have a chance to say, they're also quite practical. You know, what does it mean to age well? What does that mean? What does aging look and feel like outside of a medical or an institutional setting? What does it look and feel like beyond aging, or thinking about aging in terms of economic imperatives, with all respect and admiration to folks for whom the economic imperatives of aging are what bring us here today. But what does aging look like outside of that to people that may have very little share in those trillions of the longevity economy that apparently we are all in the midst of? And finally, you know, how can we, whether that we is understood individually in terms of communities as a society, how can we think about becoming more literate to aging, to its complexities, to its ambiguities and paradoxes, and to invite that understanding of complexity, ambiguity, and paradox? I'm going to look at Michael just as a time check because I know I'm probably getting pretty close. So I'll talk about how I get there in a sec, unless I can kind of keep going, but I don't want to steamroll Tiffany's
why don't
time.
we move over to Tiffany, and Tiffany works in music industry. So I guess the same question, what types of concerns do you have at kind of this intersection of music industry and aging?
Yeah, so a little background, I'm Tiffany Naiman. I am at UCLA directing the music industry program. I have been thinking about aging, I think, since I started my path in academia, because I didn't start my path until I was 36. And that's when I decided to go get an undergraduate degree. I'd been in film and music and all of those things, and realized maybe I wasn't going to be a rock star, so I should find something else to do.
Tiffany is a very good DJ, by the way, I will mention.
Thank you.
So you are a rock star.
And as I proceeded to get my PhD in musicology, I started doing a deep dive into voice studies and disability studies and thinking about illness, which of course then led me to aging. And you know, always being the oldest person in the room, even at school, was it was impossible not to think about it. And then thinking about artists that I loved and the impact that they had on me, and watching them sort of be pushed around or pushed out, or told to go away. I wanted to understand why that was happening and what we could do to stop it. And so that's a lot of what I teach about. And the way I think about it is, in a way, I learned a lot from disability studies in the idea of the productivity of disability. And I think it's the same with aging, right? We've decided somehow, especially with women, I have a big focus on women and aging in popular music, that somehow we become unproductive in every kind of way. When we stop producing, when we're unable to produce children, and like our use value somehow is lowered in society. And you know, very specifically, I've written about Madonna a great deal, and I'll just say, go look at her Billboard speech about aging. It's pretty incredible. So I'm asking questions about, you know, why do we keep forcing youth as the framework for making music and for making popular music? Why are those voices the voices that are the only voices that are valued? Is there not wisdom in the music of aging people and sick people? You know, it can come at any time that we can become ill or disabled, right? And how can we change the industry, both to reflect really our society, right? And who's listening to the music. And part of that is, yes, the performers, but it's also who's in charge, right? Who's deciding what music gets out there, and where is the space for older voices in companies, from marketing to A&R and all that sort of thing. So
that's great. Thanks, Tiffany. And Tiffany and I's work overlaps a bit because we both work kind of in this realm of sound and music. And you know, this is kind of the question that I have, coming back to Tiffany's point about who gets to be heard and whose voices get to be amplified in music industry spaces. I come from a slightly different industry. I work mostly with opera and opera singers, asking this question about what is an old opera singer, right? And what does that voice tell us about the aging process? A bit of an anecdote that kind of illustrates some of the work that I do. The American opera singer Renee Fleming, who some of you might be familiar with, a few years ago announced that she would be retiring, and retiring some of her roles at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, which is one of America's largest opera houses. And she went to the New York Times, and there was this big profile about her, this departure, as the headline said, right? That it was called, the headline was "The Diva Departs, Renee Fleming's Farewell to Opera." And as it has been made very clear this morning, the comment section is not the place to be, but nonetheless, in the comment section, it was surprising the kind of eulogizing tone that people took at this announcement. And people were saying, "Oh my God, she's going to be missed, and I can remember how great her voice was, and the good thing we have all these recordings that captured her in her prime." And this response was so kind of strong that the next day, Renee Fleming went to NPR and said, "Hold on, I never said I was stopping singing. I said I was retiring from a specific opera house in certain roles. And really the reason that I'm deciding to do this is because there are no meaningful roles for me to portray anymore." And this has led to kind of a resurgence in her in the most recent years. She's back at the Met, surprisingly enough, singing a role where she plays a 60-year-old woman in The Hours, the Michael Cunningham adaptation, which is a fantastic opera if you haven't seen it. So this kind of illustrates some of the questions that in opera, we assume that retirement or being old means that you've lost something. You've lost the ability to be, you know, opera's kind of main focus is the beautiful voice, beautiful singing. And that age means you've lost that ability. You've lost that ability to use your voice in a beautiful way. And so I asked these questions around why? Why is that? Where did that idea come from? Why do we care so much about the age of someone's voice, what age sounds like, how we can identify what age is, and then also this idea that why youth and beauty are so connected in this idea of what is valuable when it comes to artistic practice and specifically singing. So those are the questions that I'm concerned with. I'm going to pass this back to Andrea to go, before I say how I address those questions and why I think they're important. But Andrea, I know that you deal with similarly deep questions as one way, you know, students, I guess, would also kind of tend to describe it. So what are some of the strategies that you take to answering these questions about what it means to be old and to express that age through artistic practice?
Thanks, Michael. And I wonder if I can make maybe a brief kind of connection between our mutual interest in voices across the life course. I was going to say older voices, but in the community-based research that my more kind of praxis-oriented work focuses on, I do a lot of work with a method called digital storytelling, which may be familiar to some of you here, if only because I realize the moment of connection here. It's a mode or a technique that was developed at Berkeley, and I know that there's important distinctions to be made among wonderful Californian universities. So I don't mean to imply that that everything's the same, but I was delighted to have the chance to come here and say, for me in my career, the method known as digital storytelling has really been a beautiful way for me to assist with the conjuring of stories of aging. And sometimes the stories of aging that I am charged with conjuring or assisting develop are with older people, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But I also have done this work with younger people. Um, People that are, I guess, could be described as Gen Zs or thereabouts. Folks in their early 20s. Some of them are my students at the University of Toronto. Others are more broadly in community. And what it generally involves is the use of literature, often short, very poignant, sometimes poems, but even comics or short little smidges of evocative artistic literature that then catalyzes a conversation about some prompt. In my case, a prompt that is directed towards or hopes to kind of pull out some reflections on what it might mean to grow old. And when you begin circulating the possibility of answering those questions with younger people, you get some really interesting, often quite lyrical, beautiful, but also spiky at times reflections on what aging means, what the fears of aging might be, what is anticipated in life course, and so on and so forth, making future-oriented stories by young people, asking them to become more literate to, if not their own aging, then their own processes or habits of thinking about what it might mean to grow old. So you do that, and you put a voice record. Do that with a voice recording, and then as is the mode of digital storytelling, you overlay that. The person themselves can overlay that with visuals or music of significance, and what you end up with are often sort of short 2 to 5 minute audio visual assemblages that offer some really extraordinary, original, and I liked the word used earlier, I think by Peter, soulful articulations of what it might mean to grow old. And again, I'm speaking about folks who I think it's a mistake to assume that younger people are not interested in thinking about their old aging. That has not been my experience at all as a researcher or as an educator in the classroom. So I will share in the manner of Anne Lamont. I do not promise trips to Costa Rica, but I promise you a voyage of the mind to a Canadian website .ca called The Resemblage Project. And I'm happy to share that link with you in person if it doesn't come up, the resemblageproject.ca. And this is a digital storytelling platform that has begun to collect these stories from younger people. And I'm really proud to be able to say that just a few months ago, I was approached by a local community health center that primarily serves Black and racialized older adults in the Scarborough, that is the eastern Greater Toronto area where I work and research, to bring the Resemblage Project and its methods to the folks that they service. And so I'm really excited about a new chapter of developing these digital stories. And they will be the property, if you will, of the community health center for their archive. But if they're so willing to be shared they'll be appearing on the Resemblage Project website as well. So very excited about that future.
I mean, what I find so incredible about that is the importance that digital storytelling seems to place on the ability to create your own narrative of aging, which I think all three of us kind of work with these ideas that there are scripts, cultural scripts of aging that circulate and are often ageist, right? We often talk about kind of the master narrative of decline, which is Margaret Gillette's beautiful terming of that cultural script, that to grow old is to wither, right? And that kind of script has been fueled by and built off of the back of ageism. So it seems, Andrea, like this is a method for really taking back those cultural scripts and challenging them and allowing aging to be kind of an individually determined or imagined process, as opposed to something that's given to us.
I think you're putting your finger on what makes, for me, digital storytelling such an evocative example of arts-based health research. I think it also speaks for me to the larger question of why would the arts and humanities be involved in a broader societal effort to, I hope we have this in common, to undercut ageism, but also in so doing, imagine richer futures of aging for all of us at all ages. And in an all hands on deck approach, which I think, at the Center for Longevity, we're interested in mobilizing. For me, that is the unique tool or opportunity that the arts and humanities, in my case, literature, and these kinds of instances of the arts and humanities, that's what they have to offer, is a unique kind of interest in the individual experience, not as an anomaly or as an outlier, but as a point of interest. And that, to me, sort of feels out some of the disciplinary difference between maybe more big data approaches, say, of medicine or public health, where the outlier is something to be eliminated or ignored. I think when we're, folks in the humanities, folks maybe like us on this stage, and maybe folks out there as well, when I see an outlier, I'm like, oh, you're interesting. Let me pursue that. I wish to illuminate the outlier as opposed to eliminate it. So there's some little disciplinary distinctions in what we do with the interesting outlier.
Yeah, it's a point of interest, but also a point of entry, I think, for a lot of times, because I don't think we're as alone as we tend to think we are with our experiences of aging. Tiffany, how does this idea of storytelling play out in the music industry? Does the genre or the medium really change how we tell stories about aging?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to what you're saying, but the arts ultimately are a reflection of our society, right? And they're also teaching us how to make our society better. But definitely the music industry is a reflection of our society, and it's not I wouldn't say it's the best reflection right now, right? And so I think that also understanding what you were saying, that these outliers are not really outliers. And part of what I do in one of my classes is that I make the students go find an artist over 40 that hasn't been signed, like they're doing the A&R to find somebody of a different age. And then they find that person, they go deep into their catalog, and then they also figure out a plan to release a record by them, right? A full marketing plan, a full business plan, and how that looks. And is that going to look any different? Sometimes it doesn't, and it doesn't really need to, right? If it's about the music, right? And it's not about the image and celebrity and things like that. And that's something that we're very, very caught up in, obviously, right now. And I think that they're learning the value of all these other voices, right? And they're discovering a whole bunch of people along the way as they're trying to pick one person that they're going to work on. They're realizing, oh my gosh, there's all these people making music that aren't 15 or 16 or 25, right? And I think, the whole goal of our program, it's very social justice focused, unlike any other music industry program. And within that, there's a whole slew of people that need to have a voice. And teaching our students that right now allows them to make space for that as they go into the industry, and hopefully change it and change whose voices are going to get heard. And I've heard this time and time again, there's a lot of money to be made in having those voices being heard. So it's not a bad business model, right? And people deciding in my Madonna piece, there was a guy at BBC4 who basically said Madonna's over 40 and her audience, nobody cares about Madonna anymore. And so we're not playing her. And that guy who was 52, okay, deciding that she shouldn't have a voice anymore and that nobody wanted to hear her isn't just negating Madonna, right? And I say this, Madonna's fine. She's gonna be okay, right? But you're negating everybody that wants to listen to Madonna. You're negating her fans, whether they're old or young. You're stopping her from getting new fans, right? And when you're doing that on this large scale with this big artist, my concern is if that can happen to her, what happens to us and what happens to you, young woman, in 10 years, right? When some guy comes and takes over the company and decides to swap you out for a younger, prettier person. It happens all the time, right? And so that's the point of talking about these people like Madonna. If Madonna's getting this much coming at her and being told to go away, right? What is happening to all of us? And I relate it to them like, what happens to your mother? What happens to your sister? What happens to your girlfriend, right? And I will say that Gen Z is incredibly open to this discussion, right? And I think the youth coming up is really feeling like there's value in a lot more voices being heard, and wanting to not, part of this is wanting to not be an object, right? And wanting to be the subject of their stories and their musical lives. And knowing that they can walk into a room and their voice will be heard, right? Anyway, so
that's fantastic.
stop there.
I'm just taking a look at the time, and I want to just maybe check to see if we have any online questions from Yohai or Michelle over here.
One question that that's coming up online is, could you share some examples of how you see age contrasting with aesthetics or with what people perceive as being beautiful and worthwhile in your respective industries?
You're talking to me. You're probably talking to me. Okay.
Anyone, yeah.
Right. Well, I hate to keep going back to Madonna. I could use Grace Jones as another example, right? I mean, Madonna created the idea of a pop star, right? She created what we have as a pop star right now. And now she's creating the idea of what we think of as a pop star that's aging. And I'm not saying that she's doing it right all the time. She can have work done and things like that. There's a lot of labor that gets ignored. The labor of being Madonna to do her job, how much she works out, and all of the various things. And I think that, the aesthetics, they go across the board, right? Like, are they good looking? Are they pretty enough? This isn't just in the music industry. And it's about shifting that value and shifting away from how does somebody look? Because I'm going to say there's a lot of like not great looking men that have very successful careers in the music industry, right? And so, we have our Bob Dylan movie out right now. Sorry, Bob. But we have to shift society's ideas, right, about what we decide we value. And that is deciding that it's not about the woman's body or the woman's face, right? But it's about the music that they're making and whether or not we connect to it. And right now, what I'm hearing is people aren't really connecting to the music that the music industry is giving them. It's like a passive thing, or it's almost like background in some ways, right? And then people that are really invested in music, I think they do see the problems with it, and they're diving deeper and using things, different platforms and things like that aren't feeding them the same things. So it's how do we shift that, creating new platforms too, that aren't these big corporate machines that are feeding you the same music over and over again. And those are the kind of leaders that I'm trying to create to shift that narrative within the industry. It's the only way is to, you're gonna have to do it from the top down, right? Who's in charge, right? Instead of signing, you know, I just listened to this girl, somebody, I forget her name, from Kansas. She's like 14, right? And she's making great music, right? But also think about like the wisdom and the kinds of songs that we're gonna get. You know, our students talk a lot about authenticity. And that is something that does come with age. We're asking different questions that are valuable to be heard and sung about and that elevate us, you know, versus being background, being for a party that, you know, and I try to say music is fun and I love dancing and I'm a DJ, right? But there's still room for all this other kind of music and these people and what they look like really, really should not matter, right? But we're caught up in the celebrity thing, right?
And I think I'd also add to that, Tiffany, that we're also caught up in what they sound like, right? That we do want we expect certain things of singers, right? We expect them to sound the same throughout their career, which to me is just kind of a ridiculous thing to expect, right? We change as we get older, and that's okay. And our voices change, and the aesthetics of our voices change. But we are kind of so bound by these genres, pretty much, that determine what things should sound like. And the expectation, I'm speaking from the kind of the opera world again, is that you remain young for as long as possible, sounding young for as long as possible. And when you can't do that anymore, then that's your time to move on. And so to the question about aesthetics, there needs to be some way to value what older people sound like, right? And not expect them to sound like they're young because they're not young, right? They've had this different experience and they're going to use their voices differently. Their voices are physically just going to sound different, and there should be space to find the beauty in that difference of sound.
Well, and there were, I mean, Neil Young sounded like he was 60 years old when he was 20 years old, right? We were okay with that. It's the same with Bob Dylan. And so there is something also about gender in that and
Absolutely.
who is allowed to even sound old and be in that space of wisdom just by the aesthetics of their voice, right? And you know, I think about Debbie Harry's voice shifted a great deal. I wrote about her. And the idea, and Patti Smith too, right? The voices change. And that genre question, you know, genres were really created to sell stuff to people. And if we can get away from this idea of like what you're supposed to sound like and what genre, right? Because women in punk are allowed to age in a different way than women in pop, right? And women in country are allowed to age in a different way. Right? And so there's something to think about, like those genres and why we have them and why they're there to uphold these structures in society that aren't really that great.
Makes sense of this very broad industry, right? When we say the music industry, we could be talking about a number of different things, really. Andrea, I know that you have a book called The Aesthetics of Senescence, so I'm sure
that old thing.
you have a lot to talk about with the question of aesthetics, but I also want to make sure that we have some time to take maybe a question or two from the room. Martha, yeah.
Well, I'll talk loudly then. What has the rise of social media and access, artist access through social media, what has it meant for older artists who maybe aren't known? And I'd say both in the music industry and also, authors who can now self-publish and help or hurt.
So I think it's a double-edged sword. I think there's so much that it's kind of like if a tree falls in a forest, whatever that saying is that I can't exactly remember. So yes, you have more access, but how does somebody really find you, right? It's really difficult. And so, I'm seeing a move away from social media by Gen Z. I'm seeing new record labels come around that are actually doing A&R now instead of counting the numbers on social media and signing people that have a bunch of followers. I think there's ways too, though, that you can get an audience, and you can get an audience, I would say, also in different countries. Like the growth of the global South's music industry is enormous, and the kind of music that they're wanting and accepting is definitely more intergenerational than we've seen in America. And that's also happening because of social media and being able to reach out to people worldwide, which I think is really valuable. But the social media stuff obviously is problematic around aesthetics, right? But it's also finding new ways. There's an older artist that digitizes everything, and people were like, "Oh my God!" when they finally saw this woman that was doing this. Everybody thought she was 25, and she was 53 years old. Ancient. But it was really radical when she revealed herself. So
I'm reminded of Missy Elliott when she performed at the Super Bowl, and basically all this response on Twitter essentially being like, wow, she's about to blow up. And she'd been in the hip hop world for about 20 years at that point, right?
Yeah.
But Andrea, thoughts on how social media is maybe a positive or maybe even a negative for thinking about how we tell stories about aging?
Sure, and I will say, just as a caveat, my knowledge as a community-based researcher, I have less knowledge about industry than my illustrious panelists. So I'll speak about it in terms of the community-based research that I've done. In my experience, working with folks in community, the digital, the opportunities to say be featured on a website, an award-winning platform, for example, like the Resemblance Project. These are always enticements, but there's regularly but I don't know if I'm the kind of person that should really, that there's a sense of, I'll have to give it some thought as to whether it is the ostensible permanence of putting one story on a website. But of course, those of us that know all it takes is to not refresh your WordPress.com, subscription, and all of that disappears, right? So the permanence is a bit of a fiction. That said, having the stories up there allows the people that I work with to send the links to their family, to send the links. I work with a lot of people in the Greater Toronto area who have recently, within a generation or two, or shorter time span than that, have moved from very far afield, from Sri Lanka, from the African continent, from all over the world. And all they need to do is send a link with their story to their community that are in these very far-flung places and create a sense of connection. So I think there are enormous opportunities and affordances to the digital and the spreadability, to use media scholar Henry Jenkinson's term, the spreadable media. There's some real advantages to that. There's caveats that I think all of us are cautions that most of us are familiar with, but I'll end on a positive note. I'm excited by it.
And I just wanted to add too that I left out is that there's an opportunity for intergenerational exchange and
So
working together. I've connected a lot of older artists or people in marketing departments with the youth that are really tech savvy. And so if you're an older artist and you don't know how to get yourself on all these platforms, well, you can start working with somebody younger. And those exchanges of experience and working together, I think are really, really valuable, not just for the older person who's getting the help, but because this young person is working with somebody that has all this wisdom and knowledge and has been around for a while and is making a different kind of music.
And the opportunities that this kind of sharing of media on kind of digital platforms allows for connecting even kind of like intergenerationally in your own household, right? I've worked with a colleague, Jessica Holmes, at the University of Copenhagen on this idea that the Vegas residency is a perfect intergenerational space, right? For people who are fans of, let's say, Celine Dion or Cher, to go and enjoy that music, but then also it's a space for these older performers to draw in new audiences, and that concert space becomes a place for intergenerational community building. So this is another part of why it's important to kind of amplify the voices of older musicians and older artists. We've gone over time. I'm sorry, but thank you to Andrea, and thank you to Tiffany, and thank you to Ken and Martha for allowing us the time to speak here today. Thank you.
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you.